We will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from around the world. Welcome to our webinar on state action on utility disconnection protections. I am Sonia Carley. I am the faculty director of the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy, as well as a professor at the University of Pennsylvania and a co-director of the Energy Justice Lab. Next slide, please. We're so pleased that you've decided to join us. We have an amazing turnout today. We have several co-sponsors of this event that I'd like to just take a moment to thank you and appreciate, beginning with the University of Pennsylvania, the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy, Indiana University, the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs, the Energy and Policy Institute, and the Energy Justice Lab. Next slide. We are also very appreciative of ongoing funding and support. This is support both for this webinar today, as well as for some of the underlying data that we will talk about, in particular, the utility disconnection dashboard. And we'll thank here the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for your ongoing support. Next slide. A little plug about the Energy Justice Lab. We just went live on social media. Please feel free to follow us. It's possible that you found out about this event actually through these links, which would be wonderful. But we also are introducing regular factoids on utility disconnections and disconnection protections, as well as infographics. So feel free to follow us. Next slide. I now have the pleasure of introducing our 4 distinguished speakers today. I will begin with Professor David Kaniski. Professor Kaniski is a co-director with me at the Energy Justice Lab. He is a professor at Indiana University. His research focuses on environmental and energy justice, regulation, federalism, and public opinion. And he is also the co-founder of the Utility Disconnection Dashboard, which he will feature in his remarks. Next slide. Next, we have Charlie Herrick, who many of you probably already know. Charlie is a senior attorney for energy and utility issues at the National Consumer Law Center. He represents customers before regulatory agencies, testifies at legislative hearings, provides legal and policy counsel to low-income advocates, legal service lawyers, as well as government officials. And his work focuses on energy efficiency issues, and he advocates for larger, smarter energy efficiency investments in affordable multifamily housing. Next slide, please. Next, we have Delegate Irene Shin. Delegate Shin is from Virginia in the Virginia House of Representatives. She fights for utility disconnection protections and securing support and access to resources for residents with disabilities. Representative Delegate Shin is the vice chair of the House of Communications, Technology, and Innovation Committee and subcommittee chair of the Virginia House Counties, Cities, and Towns Committee. And she was appointed to serve on both the House Health and Human Services Committee and House Labor and Commerce Committee. Next slide. And last but certainly not least, we have Shelby Green. Shelby is a research fellow with the Energy and Policy Institute, and her work focuses on tracking investor-owned utilities in the Southeast and their compliance with staff mandated decarbonization goals. She co-authored a very important report on utility disconnections called Powerless in the United States, which has been used successfully to advocate for stronger consumer protections. And she served as Tallahassee, Florida's first Black woman soil and water supervisor. Next slide, please. So I will turn the floor over to David. Before I do, just really quick note, please feel free to leave questions as you desire, as all of our speakers give their presentations. You can leave them directly in the Q&A function. I will note that the Q&A function is closed to the public, but we will try to send many of them out to you, and we will keep track of them all. Allison Nassen and I are moderating this event, so we will track all the Q&A, and then we will come back to Q&A at the end of the 4 presentations. You will also see in the chat function that there's a roaming chat, and some people are introducing themselves. Please feel free to do so if you're interested. One of the objectives of this event is not only to all learn together, but also to share in this community. So feel free to build on this community. Without further ado, David, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Sonia, for that introduction. As she noted, my name is David Kaniski. I'm a professor at Indiana University in Bloomington, and I am a co-director of the Energy Justice Lab with Sonia. So my goal for today is to set the stage a little bit for the rest of the discussion, to say something about the problem of energy insecurity and what we're learning, continue to learn about the challenge of utility disconnections. Next slide. So just as a starting point, as many of you are well aware, energy insecurity in the United States is a very prevalent problem. According to the most recent information we have from the Energy Information Administration, every year about 1 in 4 households across the country experience some form of energy insecurity, be it having challenges affording their energy bills or not able to maintain a comfortable temperature in their house, or in the most severe circumstances, being shut off from their service altogether due to the inability to afford service. Next slide. One of the things we've been tracking at the Energy Justice Lab is the extent of utility disconnections across the country. And this builds on work that really began to emerge from Shelby and others during the COVID pandemic. As we've aggregated data from disclosures from utilities themselves, our most recent accounting suggests that there have been at least 2 million households across the country who had their electricity or natural gas service shut off due to non-payment of their bill. This is certainly an undercount, right? Because we only have information from utilities who are required to report. This number is certainly much higher. It's difficult to speculate exactly how much higher, but this is really just a starting point for understanding the ubiquity of this challenge. Next slide. So who is disconnected most often? This is one of the questions that we have been researching at the Energy Justice Lab. And what we've come to understand, this also is found in other studies, is that households of color, families with young children, households where somebody is required to use electronic medical device, as well as those who are living in sort of inefficient housing conditions, are all much more likely to experience all those different kinds of energy insecurity, but in particular, disconnections. All of these patterns emerge even when you control for income, right? So this is simply not a story of income. There are other factors that exacerbate and increase the likelihood that one experiences shutoffs from their utilities. Next slide. So the Utility Disconnections Dashboard is a project that we have been working on at the Energy Justice Lab for a number of years. And behind the dashboard is an incredible team of students and staff and faculty, a wonderful advisory board, which have been really helping us devise this new resource. And what I'm going to do for the rest of my time today is just share with you a few elements of the dashboard to give you a sense of what kind of resource is available for those of you working on these issues, regardless of what sector that might be in. Next slide. So one of the things that the dashboard does is it tracks disclosures of shutoffs across the country. And what I have displayed for you here is the data from Indiana, right, from my home state. And one of the things you can do with the dashboard is identify patterns over time, at least where data exists over time. You can look at patterns across different utilities, across different types of utilities, to get a sense of both how many disconnections there are in absolute terms, as well as what we call disconnection rates, which is thinking about the number of disconnections on a per customer basis. These data show interesting patterns. You can identify when there are moratoria, either because of the COVID pandemic or because of seasonal moratoria. And the dashboard contains information on hundreds of utilities across the country in places where they're required to disclose the extent of disconnections that they are performing on a monthly basis. So we encourage you to take a look to see if this kind of information is available for your state or for the utilities that you are interested in understanding. Next slide. The other big part of the dashboard, and will be the sort of the focus for the rest of our discussion this afternoon, is disconnection protection policies. We have done an accounting of all the policies that exist across the country. We try to update this as often as we can as there are changes. And one of the types of policies that we have been tracking are the degree to which there are heat or cold weather-based protections, which limit the circumstances when a customer can be shut off from their service during extreme weather events, be they cold or be they summer. As you can see displayed on this graphic, and as many of you I'm sure know, cold weather protections are pretty prevalent across the country. They've existed for many years, in some cases decades. but we have a lot of catching up to do when it comes to heat-based protections and summer-based protections. Only about 2 of every 5 states in the country, 21 in total if you add in the District of Columbia, have some sort of heat-based protection in place during the summer months. These vary quite a bit, whether they are date-based or temperature-based, what kinds of eligibility or constraints there are part of these. So no one policy is the same. In many cases, they look good on paper, but there are a lot of strings attached, right? A lot of small print, which limit their accessibility to customers. Next slide. Here's a map of those same data, and you can see kind of some regional patterns and where these policies exist. If you are a blue state here, that is a location where there is some form of heat-based protection in place in your state. Next slide. Just to provide some examples of what these look like, in Colorado, there's a policy in place that has to do with expected temperatures, right? If the temperature is to increase above 95 degrees anytime the next 24 hours, then utilities are prohibited from disconnecting customers. You can see a similar kind of a policy in place in Georgia. Just provide another illustration, which is based not so much on a particular temperature threshold, but on whether or not there's a weather or a heat advisory being issued by the National Weather Service. Again, we want to emphasize that sometimes when you put things on maps, it looks like all the policies are the same, right? But in fact, the details really differ state to state. Next slide. Exciting is that we now have another policy in place, right? Virginia, as we'll hear more about from Delegate Shin here in a few minutes, has just put in place a new policy in the past couple of months. So it now becomes the 22nd state, or including, again, the District of Columbia, that has a heat-based protection. And we're really excited to hear about the experience in Virginia from Delegate Shin. Okay, I think that's it. If you'd love to reach out, have you reach out to us. Happy to provide more information about the dashboard and to share more of our research with you. So please feel free to reach out to me and our team at the Energy Justice Lab with any questions or concerns. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Charlie Harrick, and I'm at the National Consumer Law Center, where I'm a senior attorney, and they give me that title only because of how old I am. Next slide, please. Oh, I do want to say thanks to the folks putting things in the chat. I'm very impressed with the geographic diversity of the people who are joining us today. And I also want to say it's just been great working with the folks from Indiana University and UPenn. We can skip about NCLC. I'll just say we fight for economic justice for low-income people, including on energy issues. So what I'm going to do, hopefully quickly, is to give you an overview of households struggling to pay their bills. And then I'm going to dive a little bit in detail into the 4 buckets of common protections, how arrearages are growing worse, even as the economy seems to be getting better. Say a few words about how geography really matters in our advocacy. Talk about what we think are the best, 2 of the best tools for helping people in arrearage management programs and percentage of income payment plans. And I just want to say a few words to beware about fees that aren't even the charge for electricity that can really cause huge problems for people. Next slide, please. I'm just going to leave you with this, folks. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. It's similar to what David was talking about, which is how many people struggle to pay the bills. I added this really just so you can take it home with you. I don't want to spend much time. Next slide. And similar data, really just useful information you can use in your advocacy. Let's go to the next slide where I really dive into things in more detail. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first bucket of utility protections is serious illness. Serious illness protection exists in almost every single state. I think there's 2 that have literally nothing, but I want to underscore David's point that this can range from Massachusetts, where you can protect yourself from shutoff forever if your illness lasts forever. And any letter from a doctor works. You don't have to prove that I have insulin in the refrigerator or a life support system. You just have to have a serious illness. So the scope actually varies quite large, and also how long the protections last and who certifies. And the flip side is the barriers. So in Florida, if a doctor wants to read the sketch, they'd be scared because, oh my God, you could lose your medical license if you don't state truthful things in that serious illness letter. So that gives you a notion of how wide the range is. On the good side, I work in Massachusetts. This has been the silver bullet. I have had calls at 3 in the afternoon from someone shut off from their electricity, and their service was back on by that night, because it's not only a protection against termination, it's an obligation to restore. So we have a whole report dives into all of this, but I want to stress serious illness protection, when it's broadly written, is a magic tool for our low-income clients. Many of them are low-income because they have a disability or an illness of some kind. Next slide, please. Number 2, David covered this a bit, and I want to have a real shout out to David and Sonia and everyone who worked on the dashboard. I used the dashboard to develop this slide. I hadn't used it in a long time. It is very easy to use. And so I just want to stress that it's a great tool. So here's how much things vary. In California, it has to be over 100 degrees for the temperature-related protection to kick in. In Illinois, greater than 95 degrees. In Texas, it depends what kind of heat advisory it out. I put Arizona in red because it's one of the few states where they actually protect you all summer. And if it was over 95 degrees, not in one of those warm months, the people would also be protected. And I just want to add, when we're talking about summer-related protections, that in America, only about 20% of low-income homes have AC. I'm sure most of you have seen that there's a heat dome in the US. Temperatures hit 122 degrees, I think, in Nevada. We're hitting records, obviously, every single year. And heat is an increasing problem. The EPA report, which is a link under that hyperlink, notes how low-income communities, environmental justice communities, and elderly are particularly at risk. We have set up a tracking tool, and we're looking at bills that are pending in 9 states. But in my decades of doing this work, yeah, hot weather is becoming a much more significant problem. Also, more people die of the heat than die of the cold. And the people who die of the heat tend to be healthier people. People who die of the cold tend to be near the end of life anyway, and the cold may accelerate it. Heat can kill a young person working out in a field who doesn't get a water break or doesn't have any shade. So I'm just encouraging everyone to focus on heat protections. Next slide, please. Elderly protections, I just want to say a little bit about. Let me jump to the last line, which is, this one may be easier to get. There's often a lot of sympathy for seniors in legislatures. It may be easier to get an elderly protection. We're thinking through, if you're working on one, whether every person in the house needs to be over 65 versus every adult. So, grandparents who take in their 3-year-old grandchild don't lose their protection if the requirement is only every adult needs to be over 65. And like David said before, these protections vary widely in scope. Some you still have to pay some money, but maybe not as much. How long does it last? Worth looking at that protection. Next slide, please. Infant and young child protections, again, a shout out to the dashboard. This is where I was able to nail down that only 4 states have them. I thought it was 2 or 3. And I put it on this slide, but it's very important on all of these protections. If you fight for protection, make sure it not only stops termination, but requires restoration of terminated service. Most customers don't know about their rights until after they're terminated and they go speak to somebody. So really important to have the right or obligation to restore service. Next slide, please. Arrearages are growing. And so there's a quote. Mark Wolf at NEADA, the National Energy Assistance Directors Association, did some calculations. It's up to $20 billion. Whether it's 20.3 or 19 or 21, it is definitely growing, and 16% of households are in arrears at some level. Next slide, please. In Massachusetts, we've been getting very detailed, very frequent reporting of data. And as you can see, the blue is our gas utilities, the red is our electric utilities. But however you slice it from, this actually goes just before the COVID epidemic. The trend line is strongly up despite recent improvements in the economy. These utilities are very expensive and people can't afford them. Next slide, please. Geography matters, geography matters, geography matters. If you are on either of the coasts, you're generally going to see much better protection. Some of the states in the Midwest, if you're working in the Southeast, you're going to see more room or need for improvement. And so it's great when advocates in those less protective areas can fight for more protections. Next slide, please. So I want to talk for a few minutes about the tools available to help people that you may not know about. One is arrearage management programs. An arrearage management program basically projects your bills for the next 12 months, divides by 12, and asks you to pay that 1/12 every month. Every month you make that payment, the company ekes down the arrearage. So if you made 12 payments on your current bills, whatever that arrearage is could go to zero. Happy to speak to people offline about that. We have a report I should have put a link in about arrearage management around the country. There's about 10 to 12 states that have them now. The other one that we think of really the gold standard of how to make energy more affordable is a percentage of income payment plan. About a half a dozen states have those. And percentage of income payment plan requires the customer simply to pay a fixed percentage of their income for rent. So one, it should be an affordable percentage. And two, as the rates go up, you still only have to pay, let's say, that 6% of your income for rent. So you're protected against all of the rising costs. Next slide, please. And so lastly, I just want to flag something that my colleague John Howard spends a lot of time analyzing and talking about. So in Mississippi, late fees are one of the major profit centers for their companies, almost as much as selling electricity makes them money. It's a punitive fee, usually way beyond the company's cost of capital. The utilities cost of capital is almost certainly under 10%, but they're charging you 18% or more interest for late fees. Definitely worth looking at that. Those late fees actually are reported in some of the FERC forms, and my colleague John Howard could help anyone look at that. Similarly, large reconnection fees. Who needs the help the most? Probably the person who's been disconnected. What do? We make it hard for them to be reconnected by imposing a large fee on them. And the last one, and I'll flag in Massachusetts. Thank you, my colleague Olivia, for putting the AMP report in the chat. Deposits are illegal in Massachusetts on residential accounts. I don't know if that's true in any other state, but deposits are just a huge barrier for low-income people. And I think that's the end of my slides. Jump to the next one. Yeah, that's how you can reach me. Again, I'm very impressed with the breadth and diversity of people who are tapping into this, and great to see a lot of friends who are part of this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you all today. Thanks to everyone for pulling us together, and thank you all for joining us and making time on your Tuesday afternoon to be with us. My name is Irene Shin, and I represent the 8th District in the Virginia House of Delegates. I'm going to offer my next slide, although I'm going to give a little bit of a caveat here and say that my slides are not nearly as data heavy as my colleagues here. And I think that's primarily because I wanted to share the story of how we got to HB 906, House Bill 906, which was a long journey to getting here. It goes into effect on July 1st here in Virginia, and I'm super excited to see, the orange state of Virginia on the dashboard turn blue finally, because we will have both heat protections and cold weather protections, as well as a few other things. And so before I get into the nitty gritty too much of the details of the bill in House Bill 906, I thought I'd share a little bit of the origin story and how we ended up getting here and why it was so important for us to do this work. Because if you all will, take a walk back down memory lane with me to 2020, it's May of 2020. And so it is right in the midst of everything sort of going crazy with the pandemic. It is where, our neighborhoods are on lockdown. Our local grocery stores are barren, like the aisles are just empty. There's no toilet paper to be had anywhere. And folks are out of work. And so there is a city in Virginia called Petersburg, where we're starting to hear reports of folks who are having their water turned off in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. And if you remember at that time, the CDC guidelines were go home, scrub your hands, wash them with hot water, sing the happy birthday song to yourself to make sure you're doing it for long enough. Make sure you're washing your clothes in the laundry when you get back home from wherever you've been. And it is pretty unconscionable to think that in the midst of that, that folks are having their water access actively turned off. Some of the instances were folks who had their water already turned off prior to the pandemic and prior to the public health crisis. And what they were doing was they were going to the local restaurant around the corner from their house to use their bathroom. They were going to the Y or to the gym to be able to shower. And of course, now in the pandemic, all of those places are closed. And then there are folks who are actively out of work now and falling behind on their bills, and their water is just continuing to be shut off. And so a grassroots community organization and a couple of elected officials and I get to work to try and solve this problem, because it is not only just like inhumane and unconscionable to not have water, but it is also now a public health crisis that can threaten the safety of the community and the health of the community. And so we, without getting too much into the details there, but like we work quickly to figure out how to resolve the problem, get Petersburg back online. You know, it requires multiple visits of both the governor and the director of health to come and sort of bear down to get that back on. And, you know, that's a different story for a different day. But the bottom line is that we were able to include moratorium language in the budget that year. In Virginia, we have a biennium budget. And so in 2020, we're able to include that language that prohibits disconnections of utilities during the ongoing public health crisis. But come 2021, when our biennium budget expires, that language also goes away. And now there are no protections in place for utility disconnections, whether it's related to the public health crisis or for cold or hot weather. And so that's where I sort of, you know, come in as in 2020 and 2021, I was working as an activist and an advocate around this. And then in 2022, I get sworn in January. And one of the first bills I introduce, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, Allison. One of the first bills I introduced in 2022 is House Bill 1054. And this slide, I write in here a little bit about like the fate of these bills over the past 3 years, because I've been working on it for 3 years. And it was a long labor of incredible work from our partners and advocates in getting here. But I thought it was really important to tell you about where we started, because it didn't always start well, right? So in 2022, I introduced House Bill 1054. And here's the other political sort of circumstance in which to think about and how it impacted the outcome of this bill, which is that in 2022, when I first came in, I was serving in a Republican majority chamber. And so the House was controlled by Republicans. And so in 2022, I introduced House Bill 1054, and it dies in subcommittee in a House or Labor, I guess at the time it was called Commerce and Labor subcommittee on party lines, 3-2. In 2022, I reintroduced the bill and House Bill 2283, and it finds a similar fate in subcommittee, also dying on party lines, 5-3. And so in 2024, you know, we come back with a similar iteration of the bill, but you see that the outcome here is different. And I'll say that I attribute the difference in that outcome to the majority in the House, because in 2023, Democrats took back control of the House delegates. And so we were able to, that is the biggest difference, right? And so that is where we landed. And I'll tell you a little bit about like how the bill process is really interesting, because I thought I saw a question in here, maybe from, it was Logan, maybe around protections at the yes, it's from Logan. And Logan asks about the protections at the legislative level, which covers potentially every customer in the state, versus legislation that might only be for jurisdictional utilities, or those utilities that are in the purview and oversight of a regulatory body and framework. In Virginia here, we have the State Corporation Commission, the SEC, which oversees utilities, but not municipal utilities. And so the way that we crafted HB 906 was to tackle both sides. We tried to make sure that jurisdictional utilities and municipal utilities had the same standardized protections for their customers. And I'll say that trying to do it in that both and approach was probably the hardest part about doing it. But also I think it's absolutely necessary for us to have uniform standards of protections for our customers. The other thing I wanted to share is, you know, and the reason that I feel so confident in attributing the success of House Bill 906 to the majority and the political makeup of the chamber, whereas in 2022 and 2023, both 1054 and 2283 died, And the reason that I feel confident in saying that it was because of the politics is because the bill that I introduced and eventually, negotiated down to in 2022 and 2023 were actually much less. We're weaker bills, I should say. We were weaker bills. What we passed in 2024, what we just passed with 906 is actually it's a codification of these protections. But in 2022 and 2023, the best that we thought we could get out was kicking it to the SEC, or regulatory institution, and to ask them to come up with rate making protocols and procedures to implement with their utilities. And so that those measures would have actually only applied to jurisdictional utilities, whereas now in 2024, we're able to do it on both sides, both for jurisdictionals and for municipals. And again, I think the difference was the majority. And I also know that because if you look at the final vote count, the people who voted against my bill in 2022 and 2023 came along for the ride in 2024 and voted for HB 906. Folks that I worked with over the past 2 years to address their concerns. The legislative and policy making process is incredibly opaque, right? It's a lot of it happens behind closed doors. It's incredibly inaccessible in Virginia. We're a part-time legislature, so we're in session only for 45 days in odd years and 60 days in even years, which means that the way that the public has access to what's happening in the General Assembly building in Richmond is pretty minimal, because things are moving incredibly fast. Things are not always hard to see, and you have to sometimes be there in person to be able to witness all of this stuff happening. And who has the luxury of driving 2 or 3 hours down to Richmond to sit around a committee room to see what's happening on a bill? I think that is longer and bigger conversations about how I think about government transparency and accessibility, but that's for a different day also. And so it's I'll share now a little bit about what's exactly in HB 906, because it's divvied up into 4 big components. And so the first of it is, one, we have the prohibition of disconnection at 92 degrees or above, or 32 degrees and below. And that is for both municipalities and jurisdictional utilities. We also prohibited disconnections from happening on weekends or state holidays, as well as Fridays, because we know that reconnection, if you're disconnected on a Friday, that means that a person, if it's your gas, then they won't be able to roll a truck to you to turn it back on until the following business day, which, go the entire weekend without gas or heat, or, that's not okay either. And so anyways, we put in those protections in that. The second piece of it was notifications before disconnections. And this was interesting because I didn't expect this to be quite as sticky as it was, but it was. And we got a lot of pushback on requiring notifications for disconnection. We talked about methods of notifications. We talk about the definition of arrears. And then there's the piece of it around what's required in order for reconnection to happen. How much of how much of a deposit or your arrears do you need to pay off in order for reconnection to happen? And in the final version of 906, we have actually different standards for jurisdictionals and municipalities, because there was such a big fight over it. And so one of the final amendments that the governor's office sent down to us was for us to loosen up on the municipality. So when the first iteration of the legislation, we asked for them to abide by 2 out of 4 different types of notifications. So you've got to either text, call, one of the 2 or 2 of the 4, right? Text, call, email, door hanger, or an in-person visit. Those were 2 out of the 5. Those were the options that they had to choose from. And apparently it was too much to make notifications. So we had to give a little bit there and concede in order to get it across the finish line. And then the third piece of the bill was that it's not just about weather, and it's not just about temperatures, at 92 degrees and above or 32 degrees and below, but we also made sure that there's a prohibition of utility disconnections when there is a communicable disease of public health threat. So, a health crisis, another pandemic, God forbid, but something like that, that there's also this sort of moratorium in place in case that happened. The fourth piece of 906 actually is the part that we ended up having to concede, and it was a big piece. And something that I actually haven't had a chance to talk to David or Charlie about yet, but it was data collection. We had a fourth piece of this bill that said utilities, both municipal and jurisdictional, should have to report data on who are they disconnecting, how many times are they disconnecting, what is the frequency at which they're disconnecting, and what's the history for this customer being disconnected. There was a lot of data we were trying to gather to get a better understanding of the folks who are most vulnerable of disconnection here in Virginia, and that was probably the piece outside of the method of notifications, which was, sort of like minor and like at the end of our negotiation process. But the data stuff came up early on as a big flag from both industry in the jurisdictional side and municipalities who, the municipalities especially, who were up in arms about it. They said that it would lead to direct increases in their cost to the ratepayers because they would have to hire more people to do all this data collection and aggregation. And, I did and would call BS on that any given day, but to get it across the finish line, we wanted to make sure that we were able to put something into place. We've done that. And so as I sort of wrap up here with my piece, I wanted to say some of the things that we're looking forward to next. Now that we've got some of these baseline protections in place, I'm hoping to go back and solve the problem of reconnection, because Charlie mentioned a little bit, but the barrier to being reconnected is often so high that folks can't be reconnected. And that was certainly the case in 2020 when we were talking about this water crisis in Petersburg. Some of these folks were facing bills as high as $700, $800, $900. And so in the middle of the pandemic, when you're out of work, you have no place to find new work, a $700 bill is an insurmountable barrier. And so figuring out how do we ensure that utilities are providing a pathway out? Because, when I talk to the utilities lobbyists, they would say to me, it's in our best interest to keep customers connected. And they kept driving that home. And I wondered, is that true? Because I feel like if it were, you would certainly do a better job of putting into place opportunities for folks to stay connected and get reconnected to their services. But that was not what that is not what I'm finding is their internal policy. So coming back next year and maybe the years and coming forward to figure out how do we make that more possible for folks. So Allison, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, it's just like contact information for folks to be able to find me and figure out how we can work together if there's stuff that I can answer or opportunities for us to collaborate and partner or anything that I can do to be of service. I'd love to be in touch.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Shelby Green with the Energy and Policy Institute. And a couple of people have kind of added some questions in the Q&A that still remain open. So I'm hoping within this presentation, I can address some of those questions. But basically, the main question we're going to try to answer here is how actually are states preserving access to utility service during extreme weather? And before we answer that question, I wanted to back up a little bit and talk about, well, how did states do it during the pandemic at a time where there was a lot of urgency to maintain access to basic services so that people feel like they have access to health, feel protected, and can feel secure during an extremely economically vulnerable time. So advancing the slide here, during that time, the main way that states were able to preserve access to utility service was actually by the direction of state public service commissions, whether that's your Public Utilities Commission, your state corporation commission, et cetera. But each state was essentially the body that regulates the utilities were the ones that were giving the orders to the utilities, whether they should ban or prohibit or suspend disconnections during a certain period of time. Or in some cases, like you see on the map here, like in states like Florida, the public service commissions were saying, okay, we know we're in a state of emergency and the governor has declared this is a state of emergency and we have some type of authority, but we're not going to press you to preserve access, but we can ask you or encourage you to do it on a voluntary basis. So about almost half of the states were successful in passing some type of some consensus on the state public service commission to encourage their utilities or really mandate them to preserve access to electricity. But most of the states in America are more so on a voluntary basis. So moving forward, the reason why I wanted to bring that up is because also during that time, we were seeing a similar conversation when it came to rent evictions. So after local or state issued eviction moratoria expired, the CDC actually stepped in with their authority and issued a federal moratorium on evictions, which then raised the conversation, why can't we do that at the national level for utility disconnections. There was an attempt to do that in Congress to issue a nationwide ban on shutoffs. The proposal was successful in the House, but then it ended up getting stripped in the Senate. And there was some lobbying on the part by utilities with the help of their trade association, Edison Electric Institute, that essentially killed that effort. And their main argument was, each utility is different at the state level, let them handle their own problem. But that kind of, I wanted to bring that parallel because that was a big conversation in a time. Why was it successful for evictions, but at the national level, but not successful for a ban on disconnections at the national level during that time? So feel free to move forward. Okay, so this is where we're going to get into the meat of the presentation, talking about the extreme weather crisis and how our state's actually handling it. Like was shared previously during this webinar, some states already have temperature-based protections, but some of the states are realizing, we had a deadly heat wave or we were tested during these periods of excessive heat, and we were seeing that the protections that we have in place are not sufficient, or in some states, seeing just we don't have any protections in place for extreme heat or cold weather, and we need to do something about this. So advancing. So this is the research that I gathered independently. I hope this is, this is as accurate as I hope it can be. I had to go through each state legislative district, kind of search through which states were filing legislation related to extreme weather and consumer disconnection protections. But from that search, this was the research I was able to gather. And so these were the states that have filed some type of legislation at the state level through their state general assembly or state legislature to either establish consumer protections for disconnections during extreme heat or extreme cold, or to advance or expand existing protections. So the states that were successful in passing legislation were Washington and Illinois. And what's really interesting about these two states, and I know we have some people on here that are from these states, specifically from the departments that worked on this effort. So feel free in the chat to also share any comments if I leave something out. But both of these states, the direction really to expand protection or to respond really came from the state attorneys general. So in Washington, the state attorney general partnered with Senate leadership to introduce a bill that would address disconnections, basically, prohibiting disconnections when during extreme heat, whether it was an excessive heat warning or some type of advisory from the National Weather Service. And then the same case in Illinois. Illinois already had an existing standard, but they changed that standard to reduce the temperature threshold from, I believe, 92 degrees Fahrenheit to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and also adding a additional condition for protections to be disconnections to be suspended when the National Weather Service issued an excessive heat watch or heat warning. And I think maybe in Q&A we'll get into the discussion like what are the different standards? Is it better to have just a certain time period where disconnections are banned during extreme weather, or should it be temperature based? But there is this growing trend in legislation to prohibit suspension of service when the National Weather Service admits an advisory. Okay, so that was a mouthful, but basically what I wanted to just point out on this slide is that Washington, Illinois had a lot of similarities, and one of them being they're both Democratic-led states, but the state attorney general partnered with state leadership to really champion the issue and get legislation proposed in the state legislature and get it actually enacted and signed by the governor. So moving forward. So some other states that I thought were interesting that weren't successful, but some of them are kind of used as an experiment. Delegate Shin just talked about the legislation in 2023 in Virginia But in Kentucky and Ohio, so Kentucky was, both of these states are Republican-led, but in Kentucky, it was really in response to the crisis that was being reported by those service-oriented agencies that are giving care and direct services to families in need, that are basically saying, we need some stronger disconnection protections in place because the wave of financial burden that we saw during the pandemic is not going down. People are still in a crisis mode. So Kentucky was introducing legislation to respond to that issue that was being prompted by service-oriented agencies. And in Ohio, it was a similar case. There was some motivation from the medical industry, but also I think speaking with the Ohio senator who filed this bill is really wanted to kind of raise the question, what does it look like to respond to the vulnerabilities that were either created or exposed by COVID-19 and, push legislation that's really novel in a way where it's protecting this whole class of vulnerable consumers. And so the slide that David shared earlier, those vulnerable consumers live in housing that has poor conditions. It can be housing with elderly people or disabled people or people with medical condition, households with children under the age of 8. All of those classes of individuals were included as the vulnerable people who should be just generally protected from disconnections. And I see there's a message here. Okay, yes. Thank you, Karen, for the additional context that you're providing. We can move forward. Okay, so I was talking about the state legislature, which raises the question, what are state public service commissions doing? Unfortunately, not a lot. There could be more activity there when it comes to establishing broader protections. But I did want to bring up this example in Louisiana, and I know there's some advocates here from Louisiana who can provide more context about this case. But essentially last year, it was extremely hot outside, record heat wave, just record temperatures. And so the governor actually issued a state of emergency. However, that did not prompt any strong reaction from the Louisiana Public Service Commission. Instead, it was more so a Commissioner Devontae Lewis, strongly encouraging and strongly urging utilities to go ahead and reinstate or to instate a temporary suspension on disconnections during this declared state of emergency. However, not all utilities respond. I believe just one utility responded, which is Entergy New Orleans, which is a utility that operates in the New Orleans area. So Entergy operates across the South, a lot of jurisdictions in Louisiana, but they also have another aspect of the company that just operates in New Orleans. And I think the pressure from that, there was a campaign from advocates to put pressure specifically on New Orleans Entergy, and their rules are a little bit different with the commission in New Orleans having some sway as well. And I think advocates can shine a light on that. But yes, just wanted to kind of bring up some activity was happening from the Public Service Commission, not a lot, just reiterating most of the direction is coming at the state level when it comes to extending protections as well. Okay, and then Logan provided some context. Okay, so where are we this year? So this year you can see that there are more protection, proposed protections on the map. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try to be as quick as possible. But as you see, there's really interesting states like Arizona and Tennessee. We see that Virginia has passed their legislation as well as Maine. And there's still some pending legislation in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Okay, moving forward. Okay, so once again, some activity happening at the state public service commissions. You guys are probably aware that there was a report published recently by the University of Minnesota Twin Cities that was essentially studying the racial studying the disparities of disconnections and noticed that there is an abundance of racial disparities in disconnections. And so advocates were using this report to basically call for a reinstatement of the state's pandemic era moratorium on utility disconnections in Minnesota. So we'll see what happens with that, but I did want to just kind of raise that up and just talk about how there is some activity again, kind of using practices that were established during the pandemic, and seeing if that will return moving forward. And then so I'm just kind of sharing all this research to say that expanded disconnection protections can preserve life during extreme weather. And I'll just kind of end it there. There were two more examples that I had, but I wanted to save time because we have a lot of questions and comments going on in the chat as well. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you to all of our panelists. We're so appreciative of your wisdom, your insights. And thank you to the resources that are being shared in the Q&A and the excellent questions. I'll kick us off with questions. Allison is joining me here as moderator. We'll toggle back and forth in the time that we have remaining. Let me begin with a kind of an assortment of questions that have asked about debt and debt forgiveness. So the general gist of the questions is, what happens when one is in arrears? What happens when one is carrying debt and they're disconnected? What happens with that debt? Who pays for it? And are there potentially other kind of payment plans that could help?
Sonia, I could take some of those if that's okay. So in general, just like Target recovers the cost of people shoplifting and the prices it sets, utility companies recover the cost of bills that are not paid, but because it's a regulatory system, there's actually very formal accounting of that debt. And so if someone doesn't pay their bill because they have a serious illness protection, and that's never recovered back from the customer, that becomes part of bad debt. I will say, just the notion of full disclosure, so I live in Massachusetts and work a lot in Massachusetts, and we have a lot of generous protections. So many people use serious illness protection that there's a separate bad debt collector, because a customer can never, if their illness lasts forever, they never get shut off. And bad debt normally is only for people who have already been disconnected. So if you're not disconnected, it doesn't go into that bad debt account. And I guess we advocates need to make the argument that's part of the social contract. These utilities have a monopoly enterprise to provide an essential service. And one of the costs of doing business is you're going to have to protect low-income people, just like it's no different really than a winter protection or a protection for elders. It's just something we want you to do as a regulated utility who has a monopoly franchise. Some people had specific questions about the amount. I once knew the amount for serious illness. It is large. There is no doubt in Massachusetts, our protections are so generous. It is a large number, and it actually does therefore have an impact on rates, and we just have to be clear that's what we want of our utilities. I hope that answers the questions.
Thank you so much. Our next question is related to barriers for improving disconnection protections and how to overcome them. So to kind of reemphasize, what are the key concerns of those voting against emergency utility protections? That might be for Delegate Shin specifically.
Yeah. This is a great question. I'm trying to think through, like, what's like sort of like politically okay for me to divulge on these conversations, but without like throwing my colleagues who are on the other side of the aisle too much under the bus. But I think some of the concerns I heard from my colleagues on the other side was that if we were allowing for folks to not be disconnected for non-payment, then doesn't that debt, don't those arrears end up becoming bad debt that then gets just amortized across other ratepayers? And they were concerned that was going to increase the rates for other ratepayers. There is more. I like, this is not the right thing to say, but I think for me, like, it came down to a lot of my colleagues just believe what the lobbyists told them. It sounds like the simplest answer, and maybe that's why it works here. But it came down to that, I think, for a lot of it. And so the folks, I showed you all this screen on why when it died in 2022 and 2023. Those three people who voted against it in my subcommittee actually were all people who voted for the bill in 2024. And so I think that there is a lot of my takeaway here is always I'll always go back to organizing because I'm an organizer at heart. If you can share stories about people who are impacted in their communities directly with the legislators to say this is why this is necessary and this is how this would have helped me or my family, I think that that's the way we change hearts and minds, with personal narratives. And I think that that's the key takeaway here. But I would say that lobbying industry is very strong and largely outmatched by the advocate, or that the advocates are largely outmatched when it comes to that. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to work together with advocacy organizations. I've got some great partners on this call, like New Virginia Majority and Virginia's Poverty Law Center, the Virginia Poverty Law Center. They're all on here too, who we work with really closely to make this happen and to be able to bring in these stories from the communities to tell and share with legislators.
Others on the panel who want to address barriers, overcoming barriers, windows of opportunity, any ways to more successfully pass legislation?
I just want to provide a little bit of historical context. So utility, and folks just bear with me, but utility regulation goes back about 140, 150 years now, and it was originally designed to fence in what would otherwise be the rapacious or unfair behavior of these people who do have a monopoly franchise. The serious illness statute in Massachusetts, which again is probably the strongest in the country, goes back to the 1930s, when I think more progressive legislators understood the risks of unregulated utilities and thought this was simply the right thing to do. And Representative Shin, I know that the argument doesn't get very far in any legislature, oh, it's the right thing to do. But yeah, if you bring the right stories in, we just need to constantly remind people this is an essential service. And we regulate it for a reason, and there's going to be some costs of protecting the most vulnerable people.
I might just quickly add another argument you hear from some utilities is that the threat of a disconnection, if not actual disconnections, are necessary as a way to compel customers who do have the means from skipping their bills, right? So if there's a perception that there are people who just don't pay their bills, even though they can afford it, right? And without the threat or the actual disconnection, you're just encouraging people to take advantage of a system. I will note that while that's often asserted, I've not seen much, if any, empirical evidence to substantiate those claims, but those arguments are made in front of public service commissions as a way to argue that this is a necessary part of business.
Yeah, and that's
Can I just echo that that's true, David, and that lobbyists would come to me and tell me, well, there are bad actors who take advantage of it. And I was like, cool, show me the data. And they'd be like, but that's true. And I'd be like, cool, show me your data. And it just it is a false narrative that they're perpetuating, that there are bad actors who are somehow people who are not actually in need of help taking advantage of these systems. And that is just not, it's patently not true.
Toby?
Thanks. I also just wanted to say that same argument is applied to punitive fees like late fees and reconnection fees, and even things like just deposits to establish service. So just wanted to say, yeah, that argument is applied to a lot of different fees that just are archaic now. We're in 2024 that don't need to exist, and it serves as a barrier that allows regular everyday customers to have affordable service.
Awesome. I think maybe one more question and then we'll round out and thank our panelists. So can the panelists address the relationship between arrearages and unaffordable utility rates and bills? In other words, does it make sense to focus on arrearages without also focusing on bill affordability?
Well, I'll just say that's why we at NCLC so much promote percentage of income payment plans, states supplementing the fuel assistance program. Mark Wolf made this comment. Yeah, you got to help people pay their bills. It's nice if we can stop a termination. It's even better if we get enough assistance that the person doesn't even face the termination. So yeah, LIHEAP, discount rates, percentage of income payment plans, absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, I have the honor then of closing out the session. Thank you to our panelists in particular for your insights today. We very much appreciate it. Thank you to all of you who came out. It was a really phenomenal turnout. We will post the recording so you have it available. You shared so many great resources that we as a community will try to help bolster and amplify and pass along as well. And hopefully we can have more of these events coming up soon. So thank you again, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.